My name is Jay. It is often said that Indian cinema produces excellent films, and today, India's latest crime suspense drama, Farzi, has truly captured people's attention. This sets off one of the biggest financial scams in Indian history. Sony is a highly talented artist, but his forte lies not in creating original works, but in mimicking famous artworks from around the world with remarkable precision. One day, he receives news that his grandfather's lifelong endeavor, a magazine company, is on the brink of bankruptcy due to insurmountable debt. In a desperate attempt to save his grandfather from this dire situation, Sony, along with his friends, approaches the owner of the magazine company and requests an extension on the debt repayment. To Sony's astonishment, the owner, upon learning that he is an artist, openly ridicules him. In that moment, Sony perceives the world as profoundly unfair. While ordinary individuals struggle at the bottom of society, working tirelessly their entire lives, they remain trapped in a cycle of exploitation. Sony cannot comprehend this injustice and is unwilling to accept it. As a result, a bold plan takes shape in his mind. He decides to counterfeit money. The key to counterfeiting money lies in meticulous imitation, and this happens to be his strong suit. He begins by replicating genuine banknotes, creating identical designs on paper. The next step was printing, and Sony's friend, Firoz, who had worked at his grandfather's printing press for years. Through repeated experiments, the first batch of counterfeit money was finally printed. To enhance the authenticity of the counterfeit bills, Sony soaked them in tea and then dried them with a hairdryer. They looked seamless, but to test if the counterfeit could actually circulate in the market, they decided to take one of these notes to a store. Unexpectedly, the shop owner detected the problem with a slight pinch, and they barely escaped a violent confrontation with a group of people. This encounter made Sony and Firoz realize that the problem lay in the thickness of the paper. Sony had a brilliant idea. What if they glued two pieces of paper together to achieve the thickness of a real banknote? Then, they pierced the front sheet and inserted a silver bar, followed by applying a special adhesive to bond the two sheets together. Finally, they soaked the banknote in tea and allowed it to air dry naturally. Thus, they produced an undetectable counterfeit bill. They reached a construction site and found a local gang leader. At first, the gang leader was skeptical of their ability to create convincing counterfeit bills and feared being caught. However, Sony, in a calm and composed manner, borrowed two real bills and mixed them in with their counterfeit ones. The gang leader examined them for a long time, but couldn't distinguish the real from the fake. He no longer hesitated and swiftly bought 500 rupees in counterfeit bills for 150 rupees, placing an order for 20 million counterfeit bills. If they completed this order, Sony and Firoz could earn 6 million rupees in one go. Sony successfully convinced his uncle, who had been dealing with printing equipment for years, to help them devise a procurement plan. The uncle emphasized that not only equipment, but also paper, ink, and water would require a substantial startup investment. They needed to borrow money, so Sony approached the owner of a printing press. The owner initially intended to scare them away with high interest rates, but was surprised when Sony readily agreed. He believed that once they had the equipment, repaying the loan would be a breeze. After much consideration, they decided to take a bold step and decided to steal it. They loaded a large quantity of specialized paper onto a truck and made their getaway. Once everything was in place, they worked tirelessly day and night, delivering the 20 million counterfeit bill order in a short time. They soon repaid the debt to the printing press owner, along with a generous tip, venting their frustration and establishing themselves at the pinnacle of life. However, one day, as Sony was settling the bill at a high-end restaurant, he he inadvertently used a few counterfeit bills. Unbeknownst to him, these counterfeit notes found their way to a bank employee, Megha Vyas. Megha had extensive experience handling currency and possessed a keen eye for detecting counterfeit money. She quickly recognized that the money was fake and promptly informed the restaurant's front desk, retrieving all the counterfeit bills. Meanwhile, a dedicated police officer, Michael Vedanayagam, had assembled a professional team to apprehend all currency counterfeiters operating within the country. Among these criminals, the most prominent was a group led by a man named Su, who effectively controlled the entire counterfeit currency market in India. With a substantial number of henchmen and a well-organized operation, Su's network was difficult to trace. Sony was busy seeking buyers for their counterfeit currency. Soon, they received a new order from a buyer who requested a significant amount of counterfeit money. Fulfilling this order could secure financial stability for Sony for the rest of his life. However, the order's quantity exceeded the paper supply stolen in their earlier heist. To resolve the paper shortage issue completely, Sony sought the assistance of a retired former employee to register a company. With a registered company, acquiring paper authorization from the government became more straightforward. Undeterred, Megha resigned from her job and joined Michael Vedanayagam's team to investigate the source of the counterfeit money. When she proposed tracing the source of the counterfeit money from the restaurant, Michael Vedanayagam was equally uninterested. The primary objective of the team was to apprehend Su, the head of the criminal group. Michael had no time for various independent counterfeit currency criminals. However, Megha was convinced that this group of criminals posed a significant threat and could not be overlooked. Megha discreetly used an official seal to sign a search warrant. With the search warrant in hand, she mobilized local police for unannounced raids on printing shops throughout the city. They accidentally stumbled upon Sony's printing facility, which was operating at full speed. At the sight of the police, Sony and his associates panicked, but couldn't immediately stop production. The final batch of counterfeit bills was still in progress. If the power was cut midway, they wouldn't be able to deliver on time. Fortunately, just as he reached the warehouse door, the last batch of counterfeit bills was completed. Sony quickly shut off the power. Little Wheat, however, remained suspicious and insisted on opening the warehouse door. Hearing the door open, Sony and Firoz hastily collected all the counterfeit money and hid it within the warehouse. At the last moment, Megha received a call from Michael, who angrily scolded her for acting recklessly and interfering in an unauthorized search. Left with no choice, Megha, along with the police, reluctantly concluded the inspection. Sony and his associates narrowly escaped a crisis. However, when they returned home, they discovered that Sony's grandfather had already learned the truth about their activities. The old man looked at them with deep sorrow and disappointment. He believed that their family should not engage in criminal activities. Sony's grandfather's brain couldn't function normally, affecting his short-term memory. To cure this condition, surgery was the only option, and experts specializing in this ailment were exceedingly rare, with appointments requiring at least a month. As Sony looked at his grandfather in the hospital bed, he was filled with self-blame. He understood that he was the cause of his grandfather's condition. After deep reflection, he made a resolute decision to cease producing counterfeit money. From then on, he returned to a normal life, living with his grandfather and sharing simple, everyday moments. However, fate is sometimes beyond one's control. Under Megha's leadership, the Counterfeit Currency Organization decided to launch a massive operation to combat counterfeit money and introduce a new currency verification system called Money Guardians in financial institutions across the nation. The biggest blow was undoubtedly to the counterfeit money king, known as Su. whose counterfeit money couldn't pass this new verification system. His entire empire came to a standstill. One day, one of Su's subordinates unexpectedly handed him a counterfeit bill. To his surprise, the counterfeit bill passed the verification test in the new system. Su sent his men to capture both Sony and Firoz. Holding a counterfeit bill, Su pressured them to reveal the real creator. Su, in response, aimed a gun at Firoz, although the bullet didn't hit him. He only intended to intimidate the two. Su then took Sony to the living room to assess his skills. Su was pleased with Sony's assessment. He then took Sony to the rooftop and invited him to join his team, promising that with Sony's design skills, combined with Su's wealth and connections, they could eventually dominate the world. Sony reluctantly agreed to Su's request, embarking on the irreversible path of becoming the counterfeit money king. This time, they set their sights on India's latest 2,000 rupee banknote. The design of this banknote is more complex than any other. Creating counterfeit money seemed almost impossible, but for a genius artist like Sony, it wasn't a challenge. He quickly completed the design work for the banknote. Meanwhile, Su, equipped with state-of-the-art printing equipment and paper identical to real currency, managed to produce counterfeit money that the latest verification machines couldn't detect. Su was delighted and immediately contacted his trusted associates to re-establish the counterfeit money supply chain and introduce these new counterfeit bills into the market. As the supply chain was restored, Su's criminal associates became active again. On the other side, police officer Meek received information about Su's top lieutenant, Lao B, who was currently in Bangladesh. To capture Lao B, Meek coordinated with the Bangladeshi military and set an ambush on Lao B's route, aiming to apprehend the entire group. However, Lao B, being cunning, sensed something amiss and started examining the terrain. He soon discovered military vehicle tire tracks not far away. Sensing danger, he quickly left the scene, and Mike initiated a pursuit. In a forest, both parties encountered each other, resulting in an intense gunfight. With the timely arrival of the Bangladeshi military, they encircled the criminals. While the criminals initially tried to resist, several of them were killed, and the rest eventually surrendered. Only Lao B managed to escape. Mike couldn't let him go and engaged in a relentless pursuit. Eventually, Lao B was captured. If Lao B decided to cooperate with the authorities, Su's own life could be in jeopardy. Unexpectedly, the situation caught the attention of Su's hidden superiors. They sent a woman named Sarah, who had strong backing, to hold Su accountable and prepare to replace Lao B. After Sarah left, Su realized the seriousness of the situation. Without proper handling, he might be abandoned by the higher-ups. He took a risk and secretly returned to his home country to seek Sony's help. Previously, Su had used personal connections to arrange surgery for Sony's grandfather. Sony had remained in the country to care for his grandfather. Upon learning of Sudarshan's troubles, Sony agreed without hesitation. Listening to Su's orders, he arranged for Sony to infiltrate Mike's team, providing him with the means to monitor their movements. Sony's involvement disappointed his uncle, who was aware that Sony continued to produce counterfeit money. They even had a heated argument, but the temptation of money had gradually led Sony astray. With Su's assistance, Sony began making contact with one of Mike's team's core members, Mega. Using his charming appearance and witty conversation, Sony quickly gained Mega's favor. Their interactions increased, and Sony saw an opportunity to discreetly install a listening app on Mega's phone. On the other side, Su, planning to take the counterfeit money with a total face value of 1,200 billion rupees, is about to enter India. If this counterfeit money were to flow into the market, the entire Indian economy would suffer immeasurable losses. Every large shipment entering the country must be reported and rigorously inspected. Moreover, they obtained information from Bai that revealed the most likely smuggling route Sue might choose. However, just as Mike ordered strict monitoring of this route, Sony, on the other hand, received information through Mega's phone and immediately switched to a new smuggling route. Nonetheless, Sue also had an informant within Mike's team, and if Sony changed the route, Mike would receive the information promptly. This led to a cat-and-mouse game of constantly changing routes. After several changes in routes, Sony was convinced that Sue must have a police informant in his ranks. Sue learned of this and swiftly arranged for a secret investigation to identify and remove the mole. Meanwhile, Mike also sensed something was amiss and confiscated all the mobile phones of his team members. During his inspection, he found someone very suspicious in Mega's chat records, but the investigation led nowhere. While Mike was at a loss, news suddenly came from the border forces that they had intercepted a truck containing a large quantity of counterfeit money. Mike immediately headed to the scene. Although the number of counterfeit notes was not substantial, it marked the first major counterfeit currency case broken by customs. Media coverage quickly followed, and almost simultaneously, several other customs agencies seized batches of counterfeit money. However, the more times they apprehended such counterfeit money, the more suspicious Mike became. He couldn't believe that Sue was so careless. Another person with doubts was Mega, who realized that all the counterfeit money recently confiscated was not part of Sue's initial stock, as none of the new counterfeit bills had appeared in circulation. They intended to secretly transport the new counterfeit money into the country by sea. However, as the cargo ship was about to reach its designated port, they encountered a large number of drug enforcement police who were conducting checks on cargo ships in the vicinity. To play it safe, they had no choice but to change the route. Unfortunately, the cargo ship's fuel supply was insufficient for them to reach another port. However, before the ship actually docked, they unloaded the 3 shipping containers full of counterfeit money into the sea in the nearby waters. The cargo ship would drift with the currents, and they made their escape. That night, taking advantage of the darkness, they retrieved the 3 containers using tracking devices and secretly transported the counterfeit money to a safe location in Anlai. Sony didn't forget about his grandfather. He not only financially supported his grandfather's newspaper to keep it running, but also employed individuals to update the newspaper online. However, Uncle knew that Sony was still involved in illegal activities, and he told Sony that he was just a puppet used by those people. Although Sony had partially achieved his dreams, there was one thing that troubled him immensely. During his interactions with Mega, he discovered that he had fallen hopelessly in love with this girl. As their relationship deepened, he secretly deleted the software he had installed on Mega's phone. Although he knew that he and Mega couldn't have a future together, he still wanted to protect the purity of this relationship. Mega, of course, was unaware of all this. Mike, on the other hand, unintentionally noticed a counterfeit bill he had received months ago in a restaurant. The layered counterfeit bill and the recently circulating super counterfeits both came from the same artist's hand. Following this lead, Mike found an official, Old Karthik, who had a large stash of layered counterfeit money. He had bought this counterfeit money directly from Sony. Mike tried various means to convince Old Karthik to help the police in luring the mastermind out. He then contacted their previous liaison, expressing the desire to purchase another 10 billion counterfeit bills, requesting that the master himself make the delivery. Sony asked for a day to consider the offer. This delay in releasing the latest counterfeit money didn't sit well with Sudarshan's behind-the-scenes bosses. They sent their spokesperson, Sira, to coordinate. Sira scolded Sudarshan without mincing words, making her stance clear. If Sudarshan couldn't open up the market in a short period, he would lose his position. At that moment, one of his subordinates suddenly reported to Sudarshan that they had discovered a police officer planted among them. Without hesitation, Sudarshan publicly shot and killed the individual. Sony and Roz, who had never witnessed such a scene before, were left shocked. Nevertheless, they had no choice but to figure out how to open up the market as quickly as possible. Therefore, Sony finally agreed to old Karthik's request. Neither of them was aware that a vast web was slowly closing in on them. The police carefully planned a transaction, setting the meeting point in a parking lot and pre-arranging an extensive trap to capture the mastermind as he appeared. Sony was preparing to drive closer to the meeting point when he suddenly saw a familiar face on the way. Sony immediately realized that this was a police trap and quickly reversed to leave the area. Mike floored the gas pedal and headed down, with the police chasing relentlessly. Luckily, Sony had made preparations in advance. He quickly parked the car on the second floor and then got into Roz's van to try to slip through. However, Mike tracked Sony's location through the surveillance. As the police closed in, Sony and Roz quickly changed their clothes. They planned to drive away, but Mike overheard a message on his walkie-talkie. Mike immediately apprehended Sony and intended to take him in for questioning. Roz sped away, and despite a close call with the police, they managed to leave the parking lot. However, their car got stuck in traffic on city roads, with the police still chasing them. Just in time, the traffic began to move forward, and they quickly sped away. But more police cars were joining the chase. Sony had an idea. He had Roz open the trunk and throw all the counterfeit money out. Upon seeing the money raining down, the people behind them rushed out of their cars to grab it, causing a massive roadblock. Just when Sony and Roz thought they had escaped the crisis, their car accidentally crashed into a flower bed at the side of the road and flipped over. Fortunately, they were unharmed and quickly got out of the car, disappearing into the chaotic mob. This incident didn't discourage Mike. Instead, it made him more determined. He quickly devised a new plan. Using this event, he exposed the criminal activities of Sudarshan, the mastermind, through the media. His aim was to make Sudarshan famous, and the more famous he became, the harder it would be for him to hide. This tactic worked swiftly, and the political power behind Sudarshan saw the situation. They promptly abandoned him and were ready to extradite him back to his home country, leaving it to the Indian government to handle. However, Sony was not easy to deal with. Just as Sudarshan's hired killers were about to act, Sony's reinforcements arrived thanks to his quick thinking. Sony immediately called Uncle to get his grandfather to safety. Unfortunately, he was too late. Sudarshan had already sent men to set fire to the magazine office, and his grandfather tragically perished in the blaze. Sony was filled with anger and grief. After taking out several guards in succession, Sony opened the warehouse where all the counterfeit money was stored. Then, he intentionally made a video call to Sudarshan and set all the counterfeit money on fire in front of him. Since the evil had started with him, he had to be the one to destroy it. However, Sudarshan still remained unyielding. The enmity between them was far from resolved. Please continue to follow this channel, Cinematic Insights. I'm Jay. Please subscribe and support us. We'll see you next time.